Welcome to another video about Mars. Today we're going to be talking about the nature of Mars and diving into a little bit about what we can learn by thinking about Mars in a more essential way. So where I'd like to start today is first by thinking about where the significations of Mars came from and how much observational astronomy was really an important factor in the development of the images that we relate to Mars and also its symbolism and its significations. In particular, there's two things we can think about. One is if we were paying attention like those astrologers who came before us did to the sky, which I'd encourage all of us to have a more intimate relationship with our sky that we live under. But in having that relationship, they were constantly making direct connection with the planets and the luminaries and their expressions as they changed throughout their cycles and appearance in the night sky. And with Mars, what we immediately notice when we gaze upon Mars in the night sky is that Mars glows with a red color. So this red color is important for us to think about immediately. Also, the way in which that color is quite different than the color of, say, the planet Venus or Jupiter, which glow with a bright white, sort of consistent white color and are very bright. Mars has a very red color. Sometimes that red color does appear a bit dull, but other times it appears to go brighter and brighter in the night sky, which is what we're going to see happen as Mars continues to move further into Mars's retrograde, and that redness is going to increase and grow brighter and brighter every day as Mars grows closer to the Earth, and when it reaches the opposition to the Sun, there's going to be a moment of peak brightness for Mars. And as I mentioned before in another video, Mars will literally be the second brightest thing in the sky to Venus. Not counting the moon and the sun, of course. So that being the case, we can go ahead and see that there's this red quality to Mars and this brightening of this redness that's important to think about. The other thing is that Mars's orbit is clearly elliptical, and because of the order of the planets, and we can think about it starting with our current the heliocentric model that we have for thinking about the position of the planets in our solar system. But when we think about them, we can think about the fact that Mars is on the other side of the Earth from the Sun, isn't it? So in that orbit that we know in the heliocentric model, Venus and Mars are on either side of the Earth. And we also can think with a geocentric model that Mars is the first planet that moves into that range of planets called the superior planets. And the reason they're superior, one reason that they're called superior, is that they're able to follow the entire path of the sun around the zodiac without having to. They're able to stray really far from the sun, unlike Venus and Mercury. And because of that, Mars is one of the superior planets. Another thing you'll notice in Mars's orbit, which is quite unique, and in Mars's solar phase, which we see from Earth, so again, geocentric, which is very unique, is the way in which Mars begins to increase in speed as it reaches the square aspect between the Sun and Mars. And what's interesting about that is that Mars will suddenly speed up and then suddenly slow back down. And then again, I spent last time in the previous video, which you can refer to, talking about what we'll notice as Mars moves into the opposition with the Sun, but that it slows down dramatically. And this is something that is similar with Jupiter and Saturn. But with Mars, we do have this increasing close proximity to the Earth just based on where its orbit is. So one thing we might notice in some of these significations is that a sudden reddening or brightening of this red color, sort of starting, stopping, increasing speed, and suddenly slowing down again. So there is an erratic nature to Mars' significations. So there's indeterminacy or a indefinite quality to what Mars does. Also, because of its redness, it's associated with heat, and we can see that when when our face begins to get flushed or when we exert ourselves, there's a reddening to our skin. So we immediately can see these natural significations coming from Mars, is that there is a heat associated with Mars, and also a quality of a changeability, if you will, and moments at which that changeability does tend towards extremes. And this is possible to see through the observations of Mars. The other thing that might be useful for us to think about, if you haven't thought about it before, but even if you have, I think it's always a good one to review. But in Hellenistic astrology, there's the doctrine of sect. And in that, the planets and the luminaries are split into two groups, the day sect and the night sect. And Mars finds himself amongst the night sect planets. So that's the Moon, Venus, and Mars. And what does it mean to be a planet that is part of the night sect? Well, to me, the night sect is immediately characterized by instinct and by the relational. And the two reasons this is for me is because with the night, we know that we can't rely on our eyes that we normally see our bounded forms with, and very clearly defined forms. And so therefore we have to rely more on our complete senses, our full body senses. And we could almost think of our body senses as senses that are hidden to us because they exist in a deep space within our body that is not visible to us. So I think that that's one reason I would say that instinctual comes into effect. And also in the night sky, a lot of lights are able to shine as opposed to during the day, which blankets out so many of the lights that we're able to see. So there's more of a relational quality that is a part of the night. So Mars as well relates to the relational and the instinctual and is of the night. And we could immediately ask the question what this might mean for people who are born with a day chart or a night chart. Might be a question that we could think of. And from this side, in terms of natal astrology, this is often used to help us understand which planets, or can be used to understand which planets will cause the most problems within a chart, almost creating like an early warning sign. And because Saturn is the greater malefic and Mars is the lesser malefic, and malefic here meaning that they are associated with both subjective and objective circumstances that we may label as negative or not so easy for the individual. This doesn't mean that they might not be things that person enjoys. There's the many complexities of natal astrology playing out there in our relationship to the planets. But in this case, we are with the nights. If you're born with a day chart, Mars is the malefic that is out of sect. So for day chart people, Saturn and thereby like sober, controlling, structuring principles that Saturn may represent tend to play out in a more productive and practical way. Whereas for day chart people, the fiery, instinctual, uncontrollable qualities that Mars represents tend to be more problematic. And so Mars would be a planet to pay attention to if you're a day-born person, so that you're able to see, that this is a planet that, all things being equal, which they never are, may play up a bit more in your predictive relationship with astrology or in your natal astrology. But how might this manifest? I think, and again, it totally depends on placement and rulership and dignity, accidental dignity. which we don't have time to get into today, but a lot of day-born people, I think, do struggle trusting their instincts, trusting the sort of innate drive that wants to push us, maybe for reasons that aren't so obvious to us, and also may struggle with issues around expressing or giving a positive outlet for strong emotions such as anger or rage. And they may feel inclined, due to their day chart, if the day chart aspects of their chart are really strong, to rationalize, control, sublimate these intensities in a way that doesn't give them such a successful outlet, causing a difficulty in expressing ourselves when we're in those places. For example, just a quick aside. But returning back to the nature of Mars, what we can think about is that Mars is associated with heat. And in particular, it's associated with the extremes that heat can sometimes go to. And because of those extremes, it's an indefinite quality of heat. And when we talk about an indefinite heat, what we mean is that sometimes there's a lot of it, sometimes there's none of it. Sometimes there's so much of it that it can cause a lot of problems because of this excessive heated quality. And we're going to explore this a little bit more, but what I want you to understand is that it's variable. It doesn't express itself in a consistent way, which we find with other planets, such as maybe the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, the Sun, Venus, and Jupiter. We do find that they express in a more consistent way. There's a balance to their temperament and their quality, whereas Mars tends towards extremes, and so does Saturn, but in a different direction, towards the cold. So with Mars, we're anticipating an excess of heat is a potential. A couple other things, though, if we're sticking with the night sect, you know that the moon rules the growth and decay of all things, and Venus rules the realm of the plants, whereas Mars rules the realm of the animals. And if we think about it, even the plants themselves are very inclined towards their own sorts of battles that go on. Some of those battles aren't always apparent to us on the outside. They seem to almost exist in some sort of state of harmony in the way that they work with one another. Obviously, this is not the case if we delve deeper, and I would say it's not the case if you delve deeper into Venusian either. But with the animals are a different kind of creature, aren't we? We have sort of made, if we think about it, plants, and again, there's variability, but plants are able to synthesize energy out of sunlight. You know, they basically create their energy from capturing it from the light of the sun. Whereas animals, we've made a very different pact. We have to devour things and we have to ingest them, and sometimes this requires us to stalk and hunt prey. And so for us animals, the predator-prey relationship becomes even more pronounced. Of course, there are variations within these realms, and in terms of significations, that's where we often get. Another one that I often go to that feels very of the night to me, and is one that I have thought about a lot, which is around the development of a child in the womb, where I think that Venus and the moon take on the rulership of the development of the fetus and the prenatal phases that are involved in the development of a child, whereas Mars and the moon work together to take on the delivery and the actual moment of crisis that leads to the crowning of the head and the force that pushes a child out of the womb. And we could even take this further, that, you know, in cesarean section, that Mars has a lot to say about the actual cutting of the mother in order to make space for the child to come out. And ultimately, again, we're with cutting there, with the umbilical cord being severed, and this severing is, in my opinion, is of the rulership of the moon and Mars. So if we turn to two images that can give us a lot of insights into Mars's nature, I want to talk about the weapon and the flame. And of course, the versatility of both of these show the indefinite qualities that help us to get a sense of the full range of what we might think of as the martial. So staying with that idea, we need to think about how the luminaries of the sun and the moon and the other planets in astrology are multivalent. They have many facets and many faces. And we can see this in the connection between the many stories that these god forms and spirits play in different parts of our world. This multivalent expression with a core of meaning is there and is important for us to look at when we think about our conception of these forms and forces. And so so there is this core, but then there's also a multiple expressions that they're able to give. So we can think of a flame. We can think of how we can have that as a candle flame or a campfire. But we can also think of a fire that consumes an entire city or a forest. So I once did a deep dive to try to understand what I was actually seeing when I looked at a flame. And ultimately, it's a reaction that is initiated by heat. And for those of us that have done any fire safety training, we may know of the fire triangle, which is the idea of fuel, oxygen, and heat have to come together for fire to come about. And all three of them are required, but the one that really ends up igniting and creating the reaction that leads to the flame that we see is the heat itself. So again, we're there with the martial quality, aren't we? And in particular, with Mars, it doesn't have to be so much heat that it causes immolation or flame, but it is something to consider when we're talking about it, that the flame is an interesting image to play with for us to start to think about it. So in this case, in terms of fire, those that don't, most of us in our worlds today, we don't have a daily relationship with its use. And because of this lack of relationship, we sort of lack the competence and the wisdom required to really master fire. But historically, our lives as human beings have been so shaped by its use and our relationship with it. And with the flame itself, I think it's very interesting to think about, like, how much even though a flame can be so small, even though a flame can be so tiny to us, that we sometimes don't realize how much heat is contained within that small space. That literally between in Celsius 600 to 850 degrees Celsius can be possible within the normal flames that we make. So say when we light a candle. And in Fahrenheit, this is, well over 1,000 to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit existing in a potentially very small place. And we can think about how when that level of heat is applied to most materials, that flame will spread. And this sort of consuming quality that can happen where a flame can start as such a small thing. Literally it could start just as a spark. And that spark, if it meets with the right conditions, creates a lot of heat. And if that heat continues to meet with the right conditions, it can consume way more and cause so much damage and destruction, actually. So again, we're with this indeterminate heat, this indefinite heat that we need. It is part of what, it's part of life. And I think this is what we need to understand with when we get to the archetypal nature of Mars. Mars is a part of the world that we live in. And it's an interesting one to think about how we don't have, a lot of us, in our current environments, we don't have a direct relationship with fire or electricity in a way that really understands it from a level of competence and wisdom of what's possible with it. So it's something to consider. But I think it's interesting how flame is both the inspiring vision for pyromancers and for pyromaniacs, that it pulls us in. We know this flame, this quality of fire is so important. So heat is something that is present within us all the time, as well, and all around us. I mean, literally, we use it to cook our food. We use it to heat. It heats our world. So the sun is also, of course, of a hot nature, but the sun has a regulatory expression that sort of keeps it in its own type of balance, and therefore, unless it's put into an imbalanced state, it normally doesn't cause extremes of dryness and heat, such as Mars is able to do. But also heat lives within our bodies. Our heat comes from the activities of our cells, and it also comes within our organs, particularly our liver, our brain, and our heart. They produce a tremendous amount of heat for our body. But also we can think about how our muscles create heat. And our skeletal muscles in particular, are part of the system that's used to keep our bodies warm and regulate our own heat itself. But also our digestion itself. And in Ayurveda, it's thought of as this important to think about this heat of the digestive fire, the Agni, that is really like our internal cooking pot that is going to break down what we consume in order to prepare it for further digestion and distribution within our body. But it's also the heat that comes with infection, isn't it? It's this potentially at times uncontrolled heat that comes with fever. And again, we're back there with visions. I don't know if any of you have ever had a high fever for a long period of time, or seen, particularly sometimes it's common among children, having this high fever, and they start to experience visions or hallucinations that start to come on when in this extreme state. And also for human beings, it's interesting, we can do a lot to withstand cold temperatures, and we can adapt to warmer temperatures. But there is a limit. There is a limit, and that limit causes heat stroke, which is a very serious thing. We can only get so hot, and to cool down is not possible, and we have to remediate that. So returning to the indefinite quality that Mars relates there, Mars exhibits a degree of unpredictability. There's a potential at which Mars can go to extremes. And it's this particular potential that is why we think of Mars as being a malefic planet. So the threshold of that heat before it leads to fire, and most often it doesn't, but the undetermined level of heat is the chaotic element that's present within fire. And I think with Mars, there is a trickster quality, and it's perhaps not the happy-go-lucky form that we like to imagine within that trickster image as a default. But, the trickster is a very riled and wily creature. And I think within that, it is able to help us understand that there is a chaotic quality to that trickster being. And tricksters are often linked to fire. Trickster forms often have a relationship with fire and the unpredictability that fire can bring. And this is something we'll explore later in another video, or in another session. But we'll see that those how this quality does relate to the red star of Mars, and how Mars carries an unpredictable form. And of course, that form can lead to intense expressions such as violence and war. Turning to Mars as the weapon, with that, if Mars rules warfare and weaponry, then we can think of the many complexities of weapons that exist and their various functions. Maybe we stick with the blade, because Mars has a link to severing and cutting things away or cutting into things. We can have an axe, we can have a switchblade, we can have a samurai sword, we can have a multitude of blades that give us the nuance. It's like a whole language in many ways. And we can think about how becoming a martial artist is, and this is something again we'll explore, that we can use that literally and as a metaphor. And that's something for you to think about. But we can think about that martial artists, they train to wield this very dangerous and sharp weapon in a way that is both functional for them, but also can be very beautiful, and similarly is also preparing them for the full application of that weapon in the many different ways that they might need it. But that weapon can also be the scalpel. That thin razor blade edge is also carries that martial quality. So what lies behind all of these, behind the heat and the blade? I think that there's something that helps us to get to thinking about Mars as force, that Mars is representing a dynamic quality that actually can be expressed in a very dull way, or it can be expressed in a very explosive way. It can be expressed in a very in a raging way, or it can be expressed in a very productive way. We can also think of that same if we're with the realm of force. We can think of drive, the thing that pushes us to do something, that compels us to do something, and how similarly that compelling is there with this idea of desire and action. Also with with reaction, that Mars is there with the nature of the things that is able to be functional within our fight and flight system, a reaction that allows us to immediately jump out of something's way, or go headlong into the fight in order for us to overcome something. So Mars is there with all of those things, and we can think about how that reaction quality leads us to think about instinct, and how some of us are so in tune with this, and if you do train in martial arts, you are training in a way to get your instincts to work with you, for you to not work against them, but also not to stray in a direction where those instincts cause you to do something that you are not wishing to do. But similarly, how Mars is related to desire and to ambition, and to the adrenaline rush that we feel within all of these things, that adrenaline rush that sort of heightens our senses and makes it possible for us to respond in extraordinary ways to things. But when all of these things are not functioning in a way that is useful for us, or functions a way that is excessive, how it leads to extremes that can destroy us as well. If we're talking about hormones, outside of adrenaline, we can also think about testosterone and how its role in shaping things to be of a robust nature, perhaps, and of a quality that we would also think of as manly or masculine is something to think about when we're with Mars. And since we're there with it now, we can think about the yang, and that yang quality is very important to Mars, and how that yang or masculine quality can be expressed in ways that are quite useful and really helpful, but also when it does go to that indeterminate extreme that it can go to, that quality can be very difficult to work with and also causes a lot of harm and damage. But Mars also has a huge role to play within sexuality as well. And those of us that have different expressions of Mars, we will find that Mars expression can relate to our sexuality in different ways. But in my opinion, Venus and Mars both have an important role to play when we're talking about the sexual. And also Mars has something to say that might be interesting around the glorification of masculinity, which can take many different forms. And I think that, we are quite aware in this current moment of the negative expressions that glorification of the masculine or the machismo can have in our world, but also the rising up of that as something to cherish and as something to value. We have to consider how that doesn't actually have to take place as a negative quality. The warrior function within our world, whether it be of a natural or as a cultural or social expression, is a very diverse and very important archetype to think about, that doesn't only mean it leads to an excessive quality. And also Mars has something to say about homosexuality as well. If we're there with the raising up of this type of form, especially male homosexuality, it can have something to say about that as well. But also homosexuality. So bringing this back around to maybe grounded in two things that might be more useful, because we are talking about an abstract way. In terms of your natal Mars, I would immediately look to what sign your natal Mars is in and the ruler of that sign, and then consider how that relationship that Mars has within that context, that sign. So the idea with Mars is planets' essential natures they're not really changing. They change within the way they change within their nature, if you will. But in this case, if we are looking at heat and also the blade, that how does this heat or blade change within the different signs? How it's sort of asked to do that nature still within the context of that sign. So just to give you an example, we might be with Mars in its detriment in Taurus, and in that sign we may think about how Mars represents a force or a blade such as that of a bulldozer. It's able to move lots of things along. Or it might be the garden spade, or the shovel that's able to make space for new things to be put into the ground, since Taurus is ruled by Venus. Or we could think about, in terms of a blade, we could think about it in the sign of Gemini, where it's ruled by Mercury. It's known to have this twin quality, and that it's a fast-paced, being able to be aware of all of its surroundings type sign that moves about a lot because of its qualities and the qualities associated with Gemini. We can think about Mars and Gemini being related to a weapon that is like a dual weapon of sorts, that's able to move very quickly in multiple different directions simultaneously. So those are two examples. You can think about it as well with a flame, that what does that flame look like within the context of the sign that your natal Mars is in? It might start to give you a little bit of an imaginal insight into the nature of your own Mars. You could also, if you wanted to go a bit further with that, look at its relationship with the Lord of that sign. So if it's in Mercury, is Mercury able to see it? What kind of aspect does Mercury make with it? Or you could also look to the closest applying aspect to your Mars. So depending on your level of astrology, you can go about that in the way that's appropriate for you. But I do think that the most important is to start with the idea of Mars being in a certain sign. What images come up for you around heat, the flame, around the blade or the weapon? Also, we can think about it in relation to Mars and Aries stationing retrograde. And with this example, I think that what we know, and when we do talk about specifically Mars's relationship to the different signs and where Mars has rulership and does not, we'll notice that, of course, Mars is in its home in Aries. And so in relation to this indeterminate heat, there are a couple qualities of this Mars in Aries that heat it up and make it excessive, and there are other things that cause it to cool down. I always think about retrogrades, but in particular with Mars, that we're there with friction, aren't we? We have this idea of Mars moving forward, coming to a stop, and starting to pull back. Heard people talk about it as almost like pulling back a bow, and that resistance has to form. But with Mars, we can almost see how Mars moves into this moving back quality, that as it moves backwards, it starts to glow brighter and brighter in this red expression. And it's almost beginning to build up heat as it moves back, and friction. So there's an excessive quality to the heat that Mars is also expressing. But it's also moving backwards and slower. And because of that, that's a weakening of the expression, which may have a way for us to understand that weakening of the movement causes this inflammation of Mars. We may think of it this way. But also that as Mars moves into the activity where Mars is in opposition to the Sun, that Mars will rise and will rule the night as the Red Lord of the night all night long until the sun rises the next day. And some of these things I've explored in other talks I've given about Mars's qualities during this time. But Mars in Aries specifically is Aries is a diurnal sign. It's a cardinal sign. It's a choleric sign. That while in Aries it takes on an extroverted direct quality, but also one that is linked to the bold nature or the dynamic nature of both fire and of the cardinal sign of Aries. Similarly, because it's ruled by Mars, we are there with a very martial expression that can be very combative and very assertive. So in general, what we're looking at is an extremely active, rapid, direct, and bold expression of Mars that can express at times in an impatient and excessive way or an aggressive way. And because this retrograde is happening within the sign of Aries, we can think about how we're really seeing this dynamic, bold expression of Mars that is unpredictable and is ready to throw itself headlong into the fight, much like we would expect a ram once it locks eyes with its target. The head is down, charging forward at full speed to make impact with its target. And so because of that, we can see how we may need to consider where this dynamic fits within our own life. What are the heated arguments and debates that are sort of beginning to glow red hot within our own lives? But also, again, and I will explore this further, how we don't want to completely ignore the information that is coming from this expression, because I think that it is part of the world. This heat is part of the cosmos. We find it even within our own bodies. We hear that within the hymn to Hephaestus in the Orphic hymns. we find it within our world, and I think that there is a need for independence and bold qualities that we need to come to terms with, and Mars's retrograde is a great time to rework those expressions within our life. So thinking about these, it gives you some stuff to maybe work with for a little bit of time, and you can expect some journeying to come very soon as we enter deeper into the Mars retrograde.